So tonight is one of 4 events that we have planned for the year. We'll be holding a series of face-to-face meet and greets, which we hope to also secure CPD accreditation for. At these events, we will invite counseling psychologists from across different contexts like neuropsychology, forensics, academic, research, and other areas to speak about how they have shaped their careers and the exciting opportunities we have as a very diverse category to adapt our skills to a multitude of settings. Our first meet and greet will happen on Friday, the 26th of April in Cape Town, followed by one on Tuesday, the 18th of June in Port Elizabeth, and then Wednesday, the 9th of October in Johannesburg. So please watch out for SAACP notifications and on our webpage for further information about these events. For our intern counseling psychologists preparing for board exams, we'll be hosting 2 preparatory workshops in collaboration with the SAACP divisions for educational psychologists and the registered counselors and psychometrists. These workshops are planned for the 9th of May and the 5th of September, and they will be category specific. Again, keep an eye out for notifications on our SAACP division webpage. Finally, we are busy updating our webpage. So we've posted the HPCSA definition of counseling psychology, along with minimum competencies the board outlines for the training of this category. We'd love to hear your thoughts on whether these documents speak to your professional identity and practice, and what you think about their content. There will be an option on the website for you to post your comments. We've also included the option to request mentorship. This is for early career counseling psychologists, if you would like to link up with a more experienced counseling psychologist to get some guidance about how to navigate this category in all its complexities. Or if you are a more experienced counseling psychologist and you'd like to volunteer to be a mentor, you're able to add your details there. You'll also soon find a link that will allow you to post a short 20 to 30-second video of who you are, what you do as a counseling psychologist, and what you really appreciate about the category. The hope is that we can fill our webpage with videos that demonstrate the true diversity of this category. So having provided this overview of the division, I now want to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Philippa Hen completed her professional training in counseling psychology at Rhodes University and then went on to complete her PhD with a focus on professional identity and practice issues relating specifically to South African counseling psychologists. She's currently completing a postdoctoral clinical research fellowship at the Center of Public Mental Health through Stellenbosch University, where her focus is on improving accessibility to and quality of mental health care services in our country. Dr. Haynes currently serves as the Vice Chair of our Counseling Division. We are extremely fortunate to have her present this talk and share an overview of her PhD findings this evening. So Dr. Haynes' talk will be broken down into 4 20-minute sections. After each section, we'll open up for some questions and some discussion. Please pop your questions and comments in the chat, and I'll revert to them at the end of each section, and we can get some engagement and discussion going. Okay, Philippa, thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, and good evening to you all. As Megan mentioned, my name is Philippa Hen, and I am a registered counseling psychologist. So what an honor it is to be here this evening presenting on this topic. So I'm just going to open up my slides before we get going. Great. So I'm hoping that you can all see that. I'm sure you'll flag me if you can't. But Ntaba Singh actually informed us this evening that we have a record-breaking attendance. I think over 400 people registered for this workshop, which really just speaks to the interest and the value that practitioners, specifically counseling psychologists, see in this topic, and also possibly speaks to the uncertainty the sense of disillusionment and sometimes frustration that counseling psychologists have felt over the last few years. And this is especially since 2011, when, as we all know, the idiosyncratic scopes of practice were promulgated. So I hope that by presenting the latest counseling psychologist data this evening, and also by offering some recommendations to the profession, that we can really continue to pave the way towards a better understanding, a bolstering and utilization of counseling psychologists within the country. I do want to acknowledge that many of you may have seen the advertisement and wondered to yourself, but where is this workforce data originating from? And where are these workforce recommendations? Well, what are they actually based on? And as Megan mentioned, I completed my PhD at Rhodes University on this topic. And so my PhD actually looked at the experiences of counseling psychologists in the country. And so I examined their workforce trends, their professional challenges, but also their support needs. So while the recommendations that I'm going to present tonight have not themselves been empirically tested, the recommendations are based purely on what the data are telling us. So in other words, the recommendations that I'm going to be sharing with you are not based on my individual opinion, and rather are based on the latest data. So my role this evening is simply to act as a vessel to relay this information to you all. And I really hope that the workshop will spark further examinations and conversations about counseling psychology in the country. Right, so as Megan said, we have around 80 minutes together, and what we've decided to do is split the talk into 4 segments, and each segment will comprise around 20 minutes, which will then follow with 10 to 15 minutes for questions to be asked or thoughts to be shared. And so in the first segment, this will involve sort of discussing the scoping review that I conducted. This was one of my literature review chapters in my PhD, and this was conducted on all the literature available on the counseling psychologist workforce in South Africa. The second part, we will then discuss the quantitative findings, so looking at the statistics, the workforce trends on the counseling psychology workforce. And then the third part will outline the qualitative findings. So we conducted interviews with a number of counseling psychologists to really gain an in-depth understanding of their experiences on the ground. So that will be the third segment. And then the fourth, finally, based on each of these segments, we will then present recommendations to support the workforce going forward. Right, so starting off with the scoping review. So I've placed an image here on this slide, and it's the front cover of the publication of the scoping review. And you're welcome to go and have a look at it online if you haven't read it already. But ultimately, the scoping review, well, the paper had 2 aims. And the first was to consolidate or bring together all that is already known about counseling psychology in South Africa. And the second was to explore the literature on counseling psychologists in South Africa from a career stage or lifespan approach. But we specifically aim to look at the research available on early career counseling psychologists. So why focus on the lives of early career psychologists specifically, you may ask? Well, this is because over the course of their professional lives, psychologists will face varying professional demands, so different challenges and different support needs at different career stages. And for example, studies have shown that mid to late career psychologists, so those who have 10 or more years of experience in the field, generally experience higher levels of career satisfaction and are also at less risk of developing burnout than early career psychologists. And also the early career stage has been shown to be fraught with unique challenges that lead to high attrition rates of psychologists at this stage of the okay, I can see everyone. There's comments in the chat. Okay, maybe that's a bit easier for everyone. I'll just talk like that. So the early career stage has been fraught with many challenges, and this includes issues with securing employment, various financial strains, needing to pay back student loans and starting up a practice, and also trying to find a balance between work and personal lives. So this lays them open to significant burnouts at that stage. And a number of international authors have also indicated the importance of focusing on the early career stage. And so, for example, Smith and colleagues suggest that early career psychologists represent an important and untapped resource because they are full of enthusiasm and energy. They have unique skills and fresh ideas. And then also they have the latest technological knowledge. And so this positions them in the field to kind of bring about constructive change and to engage with the most evidence-based practice. Early career psychologists are also the future leaders of the profession, and so really it's important that we bolster these psychologists who will be taking over the profession in the future. Okay. So ultimately, I just wanted to explain what a scoping review is. And scoping reviews are generally used to summarize and identify gaps in the literature. And scoping reviews are similar to systematic reviews in that they follow quite a structured and rigorous methodological process. But systematic reviews are generally used to answer specific questions, whereas scoping reviews are used to examine and map emerging evidence more broadly. And so for this reason, we chose to run a scoping review as opposed to a systematic review, as the scoping review would be a precursor to the systematic review. So I don't really want to get bogged down on the intricacies of the research method that was followed. And as I mentioned, you're welcome to read about this more in depth within the paper if you would like. But you can see here on this slide, there's a flow diagram of the PRISMA research design that we followed. And then just a quick note on the inclusion criteria for the studies. These involved any studies that were published between 2000 and 2021. They needed to be in peer-reviewed journals. They needed to be contextually relevant to South Africa. And they also needed to provide a direct linkage to the counseling psychology category. Right, so here we have a table which summarizes the characteristics of all 10 articles that we found were relevant and included in this review. And the characteristics that we outlined include the year which the paper was published, the authors, the research design employed, the sample size, and whether or not a career or life span approach was taken. And so I just want to point this out where I think counseling psychology was recognized as its own category after 1974. Since then, really only 10 articles on the workforce have been published in peer-reviewed journals. And again, there are a number of interesting findings that you're welcome to go and read about. And I'm not going to go into too much depth about them, but some significant findings that came out included that 8 of the 10 articles were actually published after 2011. And this is noting that this is when the scope wars really started. 6 of the 10 articles were not based on original or empirical data, and so were acknowledged as merely a commentary or a review by authors. And then no study specifically looked at counseling psychologists from a career stage or lifespan perspective. And the exception of this was my master's research, which looked at both clinical and counseling psychologists' early career experiences. And finally, the largest sample size that was used was 228 counseling psychologists, which actually represents only about 12 or 13% of the entire population. So currently we have about 1,800 registered counseling psychologists in South Africa. So you might say that the sample was not really representative of the category. We then conducted a thematic analysis of the content, and these again you can read about. I'm not going to delve too much into that. I just want to make a note about the discussion. You can just bear with me. So we identified 6 gaps or 6 critiques that provide us with a direction on the way forward. So this article we actually named Looking Back to Move Forward. And so the first being the issue of small sample sizes, which obviously affect the transferability and generalization of the findings. The second, that there were limited studies that we found that actually used qualitative designs, which would allow for the voices of counseling psychologists to come through and to express their experiences. There were almost no studies that were longitudinal in nature, and this was problematic because we clearly are not tracking the changes over time or transformation within the category. And also, fourthly, there were a small number of authors writing on the topic. So I think, for example, Prof. Charles Young authored 50% of the articles, so 5 out of the 10 articles that are currently published on counseling psychology in South Africa. Fifthly, the same sets of data seem to emerge in multiple different studies. So the study that I mentioned with 228 participants, that data has sort of been regurgitated in different publications. So there's no fresh data in recent years. And finally, this links with the fact that 60% of the articles were based on commentaries or reviews. Great. So what this means is that the directions for research on counseling psychology in South Africa are plentiful. And I know I presented this at SAACP, I think it was in 2022, and one of the comments from the audience was that there's so much literature on what counseling psychologists can do in therapy and things, and I absolutely acknowledge that. I think what our focus is here is on the workforce itself. Who are counseling psychologists? Where are they working? What are they doing? And how can we best utilize them? So I think that brings us to our first question and answer segment. Megan, if I can hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Philippa. So I've been watching the chat and I haven't seen any particular comments or questions coming from our audience, but maybe this is an opportunity to see if anybody has anything they want to say at this stage, maybe pertaining to this particular scoping review or areas that maybe you feel would be important for us as a category to consider in terms of research and investigation going forward. Again, like Philip is saying, relating to our professional identity and practice. You know, Philip, I think maybe if there's nothing at this stage, perhaps let's go on to the next section. If I hear something. Just a comment, it's quite comforting as an early career counseling psychologist to know that I'm not alone and that there is value in this category.
Wonderful.
Sure.
Thanks, Megan. Should I continue then?
Let's see if there's any other comments coming through. I thought that was quite a powerful one. Another one here, with a small number of studies, I wonder if the same is true for other psychology categories?
I think certainly there's a lot more available on clinical psychologists and their workforce data, but I can't speak to educational or the other categories.
I have an honors degree from UNISA and had to study a PGCE and still can't get a job. I think that's a comment from one of our participants just about how difficult it is to enter into professional psychology in general. Another comment, how many counseling psychologists are psychometrists in South Africa? I wonder if that was the comment. It was unclear for me.
Okay. I'm not too sure about that. That's an interesting question. Where there's sort of a dual registration.
Yeah. And another comment here, definitely there's a lot more information available on clinical. Educational psych seems to be dwindling in South Africa. Just when I read these comments, some of the things that stand out for me are, for the first one, this sense of I'm not alone, that there's a searching for value within our category. Is it valuable? Do we make a valuable contribution? And even though we might know that within ourselves, I think that we come up against so much discrimination, whether it's in practice with medical aids or in other areas, that diminish our own sense of confidence at times.
Yes.
And I think that comment really speaks to that for me. And then when we talk about the low number of studies that really talk about the professional identity and practice within our own category, and how much is established within clinical psychology, that our voice is quiet, and how do we amp up that voice, and how do we build a sense of confidence within our category? Yeah. Those are certainly issues that I sit with, questions that I sit with.
Certainly, Megan, that those are all very important points, and you'll see within the recommendation section, one of the things that may be helpful is to increase what we know about the counseling psychologist workforce, what we can do, establish or run more studies where we can show that what we can do, for example, in the public health sector, etc., is useful, and there is a space for us to advocate for those posts and our place within the profession.
Thanks, Philip. An interesting question here. Why did you decide to only focus on counseling psychology in South Africa and not in other countries as well?
That's an interesting point. So I think it's in South Africa, it seems to be a particular issue where overseas, and this is a generalization, but there seems to be less of a distinction. South Africa really is moving towards demarcating the different registration categories, whereas overseas there are a lot more opportunities across or leeway between the categories in terms of work opportunities and how psychologists are viewed. So I think also just for scope reasons, to keep it to South Africa, to be relevant to our country, I think that was important.
Yeah, on the particular, I think, focus that you're bringing up here about how categories are almost set up against each other here in South Africa. This was a comment that came through on the chat. Current categories set good colleagues up against each other based on these categories, and certainly does cause a lot of division at times. Another comment here, are there social media platforms where professionals can connect that you know of with each other and share information and share studies?
Should I answer that one, Megan?
Yeah, are you aware of anything, Philippa? I know that.
Currently, no. And I think that's also one of the recommendations I have down is we really need a centralized space online where we can connect and collaborate and just gain resources. I think that's where, with our website for our division, we're hoping to start creating more of a space like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we've got, let's take one final comment here. Discrimination is a real threat to the profession, and our training and experience is undervalued. This was never the case before 2011. I can only think that there was a hidden agenda with regards to implementation for the national health insurance plans. I don't know if there's anything you want to say in response to that comment.
Do you have any thoughts, Megan?
I think that this is an opinion that I hear people voice. And I think part of these meet and greets is an opportunity to get people together, to network, to talk about our profession and some of the threats that we feel, that we face, but also to try to mobilize some kind of action amongst ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah. I just wondered, there are two more comments here, and then I think let's maybe move on. I always wondered on the significance of the category of clinical psych and counseling psych. I see the difference in paper, but in practice, are we really that different? And I've heard this a lot too. There is a tremendous overlap between the services that we offer. And for me, and I don't know about what others think, but we really see a difference at internship level where we complete those internship sites in an inpatient hospital setting, or maybe in more of an outpatient context for counseling psychs. And that 1 year seems to have such a huge influence on our scope going forward. The last comment here is just counseling psychologists have for long been fighting for recognition by others. As practitioners, we understand how we need to shift the locus of control from external to internal for our clients. Interestingly, that we are not following through on the same principle for our own happiness. Your data suggests that counseling psychologists are not publishing on matters affecting counseling psychologists.
Yes, that's it. And it's quite ironic because, sorry, Megan, counseling psychologists, kind of a huge part of our training is career assessment and vocational work, where at what point do we start looking at our own professional progress and kind of project trajectory and kind of reflect on how we can improve that. Or sorry, I seem to have skipped ahead here. Let me just go back.
I think in the interest of time, let's move on to the next section. Thank you so much for everybody's comments. And, maybe there's a space, online platform where these kind of discussions can continue. I really don't want to sideline anybody, but let's move on to the next section for the time being.
Great. Okay, thanks, Megan. So the section, the second segment is based on the workforce data, so the quantitative or statistical data that we found on the counseling psychologist workforce. And this was the first phase of my PhD, and we had three main objectives. And this data is currently under review with Counseling Psychology Quarterly, the journal, and we should have this published within the next few weeks. So hopefully you can keep an eye out for that. But the objectives were mainly to look at the workforce trends of early career psychologists, as well as established psychologists, and then to investigate if there were differences and similarities between the two groups. And then we also finally wanted to assess the demographic profiles of these two groups so that we could kind of gain an insight into any transformation that was happening within the category over time. So again, I just don't want to get too bogged down with the method, but we were able to recruit 512 HPCSA registered counseling psychologists, and it would be interesting to see how many of you actually completed this survey, so this first phase. You might recall, so it was in 2021, I think, when we sent out the survey for this. And we had around 40% indicating that they were early career. So those who had sort of registered an independent practice within the last 10 years, and around 60% who had 10 or more years experience. And as I mentioned, it was a survey that we sent out. It was an online survey, and we gained a full list of email addresses from the HPCSA. And sure, we were really quite lucky in the sense that we were able to do this before the POPI Act came out. So I'm not quite sure how we would have negotiated that now, but we were quite lucky in that sense. And then we did gain ethical clearance. So in terms of the demographic profile, it was very interesting where we found significant differences between the two career stages, where age, race, geographic location, highest degree attained, and languages spoken were quite different between the two career stages. So, for example, early career psychologists who graduated in the last 10 years, 85% actually represented females compared to more established counseling psychologists, where 76 were represented by women. And then in terms of race, so what I've done here is I've outlined the predominant findings for the demographic profile. So this is just what comprised the majority, and this is what I've outlined. So the majority were white in terms of early career counseling psychologists, and this was 59% compared to those in the established stage, where 84% represented white counseling psychologists. And then in terms of geographic location, this was very interesting. So Gauteng had more than half of early career counseling psychologists, followed by the Eastern Cape and then the Western Cape, whereas with established counseling psychologists, they were almost near evenly distributed between Gauteng and the Western Cape, and then this was followed by KZN. And what we think could have been the reason behind this is that many of the counseling psychology programs in the Western Cape have actually been disbanded, discontinued. So I know, for example, Stellenbosch, UWC, UCT, etc. So this might be the reason for that. Age, this is quite something to be expected. And then language, this was also interesting. So 44% of early career counseling psychologists could speak a language, an African language other than English or Afrikaans, compared to only 19% who were established counseling psychologists. And then 9% held a PhD, compared to 25% in the established stage. In terms of work settings, there were varied employment patterns, but a notable proportion of both career stages were in private practice. And one of the really interesting findings was that 80% of early career counseling psychologists, so those who graduated in the last 10 years, indicated that they had initially tried to find work outside of private practice, but were either unsuccessful or decided not to go that route. And so 55% ended up in private practice. And this was followed by 10% in student counseling centres and then correctional facilities. Established counseling psychologists were mainly found in private practice and then followed by corporate and academic settings. So this was quite an interesting finding. And then urban versus rural. So the majority of both career stages were found in urban rather than rural areas. Sorry, I seem to have... Great. We then asked a question about the degree of psychopathology seen in clients, and both groups, 2/3 seem to see moderate cases of psychopathology on a daily basis. So what this means is the majority of counseling psychologists felt that the majority of the day they saw at least moderate psychopathology. And this sort of explains a lot of the reason of the frustration with the 2011 scopes of practice, which sort of insinuated or alluded to not being able to work with psychopathology or diagnose, etc. And then the majority of both career stages did engage in regular supervision. But interestingly, supervision was formal and paid for by early career psychologists, whereas established counseling psychologists generally engaged in informal, non-paid, and peer supervision. And this was interesting because one of the significant challenges in the early career stage is financial strain and the pressure of starting out, getting registered, starting a practice, and then needing to pay for individual supervision. That was quite interesting. And then both career stages only indicated engaging in supervision really on an as-needed basis. So this suggests that it's not as regular as we would probably hope, or that it should be. Great, and then we asked a few questions on career satisfaction. This was interesting in that in terms of income, primary work setting, employment opportunities available, and work-life balance, early career psychologists were significantly less satisfied than more established counseling psychologists. And this proves or suggests that the early career stage really is quite unique in that it's got these unique particular challenges. And then the choice of counseling psychology as a career, both career stages were equally satisfied. Both career stages were equally dissatisfied with the formal support available to them on their transition into the workforce. So as an early career psychologist, they felt that there was a lack of support or limited support. And then we asked them asked participants if they were able to choose again, would 50% said that they would choose clinical psychology if they were to start over their careers. And this was similar for established counseling psychologists, where 46 said that they would rather choose clinical. And then this was also really quite a concerning finding, where 67% of early career counseling psychologists indicated that it was possible, likely, or rather likely, that they would immigrate within the next 5 years. And that's 2/3 of our early career psychologists. So what did we gain from this? Well, what we understood from this data is that a large proportion of counseling psychologists are in their early career stage. And so there is a need for ongoing research on this vulnerable group. There is a positive trend in demographic diversity among the latest counseling psychologists, but the transformation is slow. And what we can we might explain this by is that so few counseling psychologists are selected and trained each year. And so the sort of number of new psychologists we're bringing into the profession is not nearly enough. There's a major gender imbalance, and we can see that where in the latest cohort, there's 87% represented by women. And then there's a major clustering in urban areas, which contradicts the government's efforts to decentralize services across the country. Overall, we can gain from the data that counseling psychologists are quite fulfilled and satisfied in the actual work that they do. And this is because of the altruistic nature of of the work, but there is major dissatisfaction in terms of the evolving regulatory restrictions and then the subsequent fallouts, the negative registration category experiences that are associated with the regulation changes. So overall, this quantitative data suggests an underutilization and poor distribution of counselling psychologists across the country. And what we might suggest to kind of mitigate this or rectify this is through the creation of posts for counselling psychologists in the public health sector. Australia are quite similar in that the majority of their counselling psychologists are in private practice. And what they do there is that the government reimburses counselling psychologists in private practice so that each member, for example, each citizen can access those services or claim those back from a private practitioner. So that's another thought. And then there are many ways that we can improve. So I'm going to leave that for the recommendations section. So before we go into the qualitative data, are there any questions or comments just on the stats?
There've been a couple of comments posted on the chat. Maybe I'm just going to try and summarize them. And I think some of them have come up in your discussion as well, Philippa. This question around why counselling psychologist posts are not available in public health, and the real limitations around access to service that creates, because we have the expertise, and yet there are these barriers to us working in these settings. And then there was a comment around how the public doesn't really seem very aware of the differences across categories. And I think, again, that's an interesting point to note about how that then translates around help seeking and the kinds of clients that we then sit with in our offices. A question around transverse registration, I think this is going to come up more and more. Why has this been introduced? What are the kinds of threats that this might pose to us as a category, given the option for people to transverse, and yet then the limitations around the internship requirements in order for people to do that. And again, I wonder whether there isn't an opportunity or a platform for these kinds of discussions to be had, because they're coming up in small groups, in discussions in hallways and visits around this transverse registration issue, and yet we're not really coming together and talking it through and talking about people's opinions. And then the HPCSA proposal at one stage to train psychologists at doctoral level, and now to move towards a more generalist category. And there's obviously been a lot of response and reaction around that. And questions from people saying, where are we on this, and where's the board sitting there? So these are just some of the discussions that have come up in our chat, and no, we don't have the answers to all of these at this stage, but it really does seem to speak to me for the need of some kind of platform where we can engage more meaningfully around these topics. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Philippa.
I think, Megan, while you were talking, I was thinking about, so one of the other findings that have come through is that the differences between the categories seem to lessen within private practice. I know previously there were issues with medical aid, but specifically between counselling and clinical psychologists, I know educational are kind of fighting their own fight at the moment. But many counselling psychologists feel that also going into private practice evens the playing fields a little bit more for them in terms of remuneration, and where I think someone mentioned where the public aren't aware of the different categories, and so there's less of a hierarchy in a sense in private practice than when applying for jobs or roles. Yes, so that was just a thought that came to mind.
And just going back to this question around the role counselling psychologists can play in public health, I know that on our training program, there is such a strong focus on community psychology and learning how to work systemically and working from a community psych perspective, and what an incredible skill set that would provide in public mental health settings. And again, it's frustrating that that isn't being utilized.
Absolutely.
So just to go to some of the comments in the chat here, the first one here, don't you think immigration rate goes down after 10 years in practice due to immigration rules, as it's more difficult to immigrate when you're older in some countries? Do you not think that gender differences is across most psychology categories, educational psych at some universities only choose limited male applicants? It's an interesting comment. I'm going to read a couple and then you can pick up anything that you want to explore further. It's my thinking that males may choose clinical psych due to employment opportunities. Has this ever been researched? I think interesting point. Stats are quite saddening, given that I also seriously considered immigration or applying for clinical in order to have dual registration. However, it's also quite upsetting that counseling psychologists engage in more talk therapy time in relation to clinical, as they just see a patient, identify symptoms, diagnose, and refer. I'm not sure all clinical psychs would agree with that last description, but thanks for your comment there. I don't know if you want to add anything, Philippa.
Sure. Yeah. I think was that the last comment, Megan?
There are a couple more. Should I keep going?
I'm just wondering how we're doing for time.
It's 5 minutes to 7.
Okay. Maybe we can have one or two.
Okay. HBCSA keeps changing its mind. I find that GPs do not know the scope of counseling psychs. They tend to refer everything to clinical psychs. And I think that there's a lot to be said there for the kind of referral network also that you generate. I know some of the feedback that we've also received from some of the psychiatrists we work with here is, how different categories promote themselves and their scope of practice. And possibly that's really something that we need to also take on board is how do we promote what counseling psychologists do within our referral networks.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Do you want to continue with the qualitative data, and then I'll make some notes of the comments here as you go?
Yes. I think, Megan, many of the comments that are coming through are actually going to be speaking to the qualitative data. So I think it's quite appropriate maybe if I present the data, and then it may answer, it may a few questions, it may probe more questions. Let's see how we go with that. Okay. Great. So this paper we published with SAACP, so South African Journal of Psychology, and it is available if you are interested in sort of reading more in depth. I know we've only got 20 minutes to present this, so if you're interested, you can go and have a look. But the main aim of this qualitative section was to explore the professional experiences of career counseling psychologists in South Africa with a focus on their challenges and their support needs. So we looked at the quantitative data, which was a more broad perspective on the category, but then the interviews to look kind of on the ground, what are counseling psychologists' experiences, the texture, the colors, etc. So what we did is we recruited 10 early career counseling psychologists, so those who had registered as independent practitioners between 2010 and 2020. And we spent between 60 minutes and 90 minutes conducting semi-structured interviews. And how we did this is at the end of the survey, participants were asked to indicate their willingness to engage in an interview as a follow-up. And so anyone who was interested was then emailed, and the first 10 to indicate their interest were then selected or recruited for this phase of the study. And this phase, we followed the interpretive phenomenological analysis framework and approach. And again, because it was a part of the main study, we did have ethical clearance for this too. So this is a summary of the 10 participants that we interviewed. And I just want to draw your attention to, again, the fact that the majority were female, that they were white and working in private practice. And this was not done intentionally, but it does seem to be quite representative of the broader category at present. So we found 3 subordinate themes, so 3 major themes or experiences that counseling psychologists had on entering the workforce. And the first was the complexity of finding and securing work. And so the sub-themes within this was that participants felt that they weren't ready to sort of transition into the workforce, and experienced quite a bit of professional disillusionment. So what is meant by this is that many counseling psychologists had particular expectations of what it was going to be like on entering the field and actually doing the work. And then when they graduated and they finished, they felt like it was quite the opposite, or it wasn't what they were expecting. And in terms of pro-work readiness, it was less so an issue of content and material and feeling well trained, but more an issue of how to market themselves, how to set up a private practice, how to get registered with the HBCSA, etc. There was one participant who mentioned that she didn't know about the BHF for months and was practicing kind of in that way. So that was interesting. One of the other themes was that there were limited employment opportunities outside of private practice. And this is not a new finding. This has come up quite a bit, where counseling psychologists explained that although private practice wasn't necessarily their first choice, they felt that they were pushed into private practice because that was a more it gave them an income, it evened the playing fields with clinical psychologists, and there just were no jobs for them in the public health sector or even in schools, because now educational psychologists are preferred over counseling psychologists in those settings. And then within this theme, participants also mentioned that there were advantages and disadvantages of private practice. So they had varying levels of career satisfaction. And the advantages they saw in private practice is that it allowed them a sense of autonomy. It gave them flexibility in terms of working in their own hours. But then the major disadvantages involve sort of an unpredictable income, and that certain months were better than others, etc., things like that. Okay, the second major theme was that counseling psychologists reported navigating a number of different personal, professional, and systemic challenges. And the first major one was grappling with their own sense of professional identity. And what was interesting in this study was that many of the participants had actually pursued other careers or aspired to be clinical psychologists first, and then by default ended up sort of applying for a counseling psychology program or applied for all of the programs, and then sort of to increase their chances of being accepted into some training program. The second was a sense of subordination within the field, so feeling that there's a false hierarchy. And then also someone mentioned in the comments about a sort of a lack of understanding about the different registration categories, and this came through in the qualitative data quite strongly, where the public, but also healthcare professionals, whether it's GPs, psychiatrists, physios, OTs, and psychologists themselves, did not understand the differences between the categories. There were also significant financial challenges, finding a work-life balance, and again, sorry about the spelling there, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was significant because many of the early career psychologists had only just started off practice. So trying to establish themselves in the midst of that, you can imagine, was came with its own stresses and complications. And then many participants also contemplated immigration. And what was interesting about this is that the participants reported that this was due to poor work opportunities within South Africa as a counseling psychologist, the apparent hierarchy within the field, and then finally because of political and safety concerns. And then the final theme that came out of their experiences was that there was really sort of limited professional support available for counseling psychologists. And so what these participants mentioned is that they were self-acquiring support. And this, with the only exception, was counseling psychologists who found themselves in group private practices, where they mentioned they were able to gain a lot of support from their colleagues. But many other counseling psychologists felt that their only methods of gaining support were through personal therapy, gaining supervision, and networking. But these were all self-initiated, and they did not feel that there was anything available to help them transition from being a student or an intern to an independent professional. And then finally, they mentioned also difficulties in obtaining individual peer supervision. And this is where many participants mentioned that they had to pay for formal supervision because accessing more senior colleagues, obviously with time constraints, their own time constraints, it's difficult to kind of find someone to supervise them on a consistent basis. That was also on a not as costly basis. So I think I'm going to stop there before going on to recommendations. Megan, I don't know if I'm sure there are more comments coming through.
Yes, there are. I wanted to read this one, and I thought it's so striking. I'm not sure why people seem this bleak. I'm an early career counseling psychologist and have not experienced the hierarchical discrimination that's been spoken about here, not from peers, medical aides, or clients. I do, however, understand this dynamic, but I also feel that claiming one's space really enables one to thrive in any specific environment. And I just want to link this comment to some of the stats that you were talking about, that, yeah, 50% of the sample, I think it was an early career and more established, would say that they would choose a different category, but 50% said they wouldn't. And,
yes.
and that's interesting to me. Like, what is it about what that 50% have done in order to thrive in this category,
yes.
in this space? Because we get bogged down by a lot of the frustrations and the discrimination that we experience, yes, but despite that, there are many counseling psychologists I've spoken to around this transverse registration who said there's not a chance that they would consider another category. And there's something about our professional identity and something about what this category represents that many of us really truly identify with, and it creates a lot of self-fulfillment for us. So
absolutely, Megan, and I think there's such a need for more kind of investigations into that. I couldn't agree more. Enough said. I'm not going to repeat.
And then another interesting point, for anyone believing that there aren't positions available for counseling psychologists, please consider these vacancies. And there's a couple of links there. And we're also going to use the website, hopefully to create awareness around work opportunities. So if you hear of anything, please send that in to us at the division so that we can post them on the website, and that it can also become a centralized point for people to think about and access these sorts of resources. Just a comment that this particular article was really good. Could you show the paper again, Philippa, so people can just get the title and the authors?
Sure.
Here, I think statistically, there's gender imbalances within the field, the psychology field generally. I'm working in corporate, industrial psych, and find gender still skewed there. Not a single Black person represented in your sample. Maybe you want to comment a little bit about that?
I think they are.
Very, very few, hey?
I think, again, it speaks to sort of the category at the moment where there is still a lot of work and transformation that needs to be done. And that's one of the recommendations that we'll speak about in a bit.
And then, this comment has come up quite a bit around almost competing with registered counselors and social workers for roles that counseling psychologists would be very suitable for. And one of the comments by, I think it was a registered counselor saying, we, the frontline workers there, but again, I think it speaks to some of the frustration the counseling psychologists face about, well, where do we fit in, particularly in a public health setting? And there doesn't really seem to be a slot or a space for us. Here's a comment: counseling psychologists have space in public hospitals. However, the demand for services gets to be referred to the clinical psych. If the council can advocate for counseling psychologist positions to be available in government clinics. And that's maybe something that we could take and explore higher up within SAACP, some kind of advocacy role for counseling psychs in terms of this positions in government clinics, as well as somebody else made another comment. But we'll see what we can do there. Poor work opportunities apply to many different professions in South Africa at the moment. It's true, social workers get preference in cases where counseling psychologists could have played a crucial role. Okay, I think let's maybe stop there. I don't know if there's any particular comment that you want to pick up on at this stage, Philippa.
I think there are there more comments, Megan. I'm just seeing more and more coming through. I'm not sure. Would you like to stop there?
Would you like us? We can read through some more of them. We've got a bit of time, hey? Should I keep going?
Perhaps should we finish off the recommendations and then kind of open the floor?
Yeah.
That might answer a few questions or thoughts. Okay, so in terms of the recommendations and how I approach them, many of you would be familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, where we understand that the individual is based within context. So how I perceive this was kind of starting off with the individual, so the individual counseling psychologist with their recommendations. So the first was for them to engage in their own critical self-reflection, to become familiar with information on being an early career psychologist, but also being a counseling psychologist in South Africa and what this means. So this might look like working through the literature, working through websites, engaging on social media platforms, also talking with peers and family, trainers, supervisors, or even your personal therapist. So we saw that engaging in personal therapy was one of the major forms of support as an early career psychologist. And then also utilizing career assessment and guidance services, where this is something we're trained in. We should kind of practice what we preach and use these services too. And also allow our career aspirations and decisions to be guided by genuine self-reflection. So if we feel pulled towards a certain direction, like working in public health, mental health, for example, to see how we can be proactive in creating those spaces for ourselves, and being creative about it as well. And then that kind of speaks to capitalizing on opportunities to gain employment and to provide services. And this might involve kind of research and taking opportunities to meet with more senior colleagues who work in those settings. So see if, and this is where the website I think might be quite helpful, where counselling psychologists who do work in particular settings, whether it's community settings or rehabs or NGOs or public health, can share their stories and offer mentorship to newly qualified counselling psychologists, and also inspire future counselling psychologists. One of the other findings was that developing a niche area was quite helpful to securing work. And this was in the sense, for example, focusing more on children or focusing on community projects or whatever it may be. Finding a niche and gaining confidence in that area was very useful in securing work, whether it be in private practice or an employment opportunity. And then also to make use of informal networks. So networking was also a major form of support for counselling psychologists, whether it was a supervisor or a colleague, were able to mention an opportunity, and that counselling psychologist was able to secure it in that way. And then to be an advocate for the counselling psychology category. One of the unfortunate things that pieces of data that was coming through was that counselling psychologists tended to actually identify themselves as merely psychologists, which we obviously perpetuates the cycle where, of course, there's not going to be that understanding of what a counselling psychologist does if we are identifying ourselves as merely psychologists. And then to be proactive in pioneering social justice, community outreach and intervention initiatives, and then also to incorporate pro bono and reduced rate services where possible. So one of the findings was that participants really, who did try to go into community settings or NGOs, etc., said that while there were numerous opportunities to provide services, those opportunities were either not remunerated, or they were very they weren't well paying at all. And so that's where I think many of the participants explained that in private practice, they felt that their way of contributing in kind of in increasing access to services was by offering pro bono or reduced rate services within private practice. So that was quite an interesting finding. And although that's not a long-term solution by any means, that was interesting. And then to manage work-life balance challenges and high workloads. So it'll be important for counselling psychologists to develop firm work-life boundaries, to engage in self-care, so to practice what we preach, reduce our workloads and our work hours where possible, and also to take a break from the profession if financially viable. So one of the findings in the paper, if you get the chance to read about it, I think it was almost half of the participants at some point took a break from practicing in order to venture into something else, whether it was teaching or wedding planning or marketing, which obviously is not viable for all counselling psychologists by any means, but if you can take a break, that seemed to be an option, a good approach to mitigating burnout. And then for individual counselling psychologists to seek out support, to commit to personal therapy and mentorship and supervision, to build connections, to network, to establish a support structure, and to become an active member in professional organizations. And I think that's where, with the division, we're hoping to increase membership and engagement. And then finally, to encourage continuing engagement in CPD workshops and training. So it doesn't end when you finish your training. Your professional development is ongoing. Right, then recommendations for training programs. Obviously, first is the master selection. So we need to select and train more Black, male particularly, and multilingual counseling psychologists. And then in terms of the academic curriculum, we need to reinforce and revisit trainees' understanding of what it means to be a counseling psychology. What is the professional identity of a counseling psychologist? I think many counseling psychologists are not aware, and thank you again, Megan, for indicating that on our website. We're going to be putting up the definition or the list of professional competencies, and then to provide trainees with resources on the range of available career opportunities. So yes, of course, there's private practice, there's public health, but what other opportunities are there? I think counseling psychologists, we can wear many hats. And so how can we utilize our skills in different sectors and be innovative? So we need to perhaps introduce a self-care and work-life balance module into the training curriculum, and then to ensure that this is actually being practiced within the practical elements of perhaps an internship, where I'm aware that in many internship sites, counseling psychologists are overworked and burnt out before they even start practicing as independent practitioners. And then possibly to incorporate a business or private practice module. So how to start, how to market yourself, how to bill, what fees you should be charging, etc., etc. Encouraging trainees to become members of organizations, and then obviously to integrate more training on telepsychology services. So obviously with COVID, we all know that there was a major shift to the provision of online psychotherapy. And I think one of the findings was that more needs to be done now, where early career psychologists who do not have the financial means to set up an office, etc., might have the option to provide or start their practice via online means, which would be more financially viable for them, might be. So there's a number of recommendations in terms of the practical side. So we mentioned earlier about developing trainees' niche areas, so their interests, building more opportunities for learning. So in these settings, so for example, community-based settings, focusing on building trainees' self-confidence and self-efficacy, integrating self-care and work-life balance into the practical element, and I mentioned that earlier. And then here, this might be a contentious one, but require counseling psychologists to complete a mandatory paid community service year. And I think, so this one comes where a lot of the hierarchy also stems from this difference, where it's not that counseling psychologists are necessarily wanting to work with psychopathology and all in the same role as clinical psychologists in the public health sector, but that we can work from a preventative, community-based approach from these settings, and that community service year could allow us that opportunity. And then I mentioned before, modeling the offering of pro bono services or sliding scale services. And then encouraging networking and peer support. So it would be important for trainees to network within their own classes, but also between training programs. So master's programs might want to host alumni events so that they could also inspire future counseling psychologists and maintain those strong networks. And then the program structures, we need to continue to evaluate the training programs to ensure that sort of the ethos of counseling psychology and counseling psychologists continues to come through. So we need to clarify any variations across counseling psychology training programs. One of the aspects that also came through in the qualitative data is that many of the counseling psychologists trained in different ways. So for example, many mentioned that they had trained with clinical psychologists. They had all their classes together, but the internship was where they split. And in other counseling programs, they trained with educational psychologists, etc. So that was something worth looking at. Assisting trainees to secure funding, and then offering national awards to training programs that do assist in the facilitation of successfully transitioning early career counseling psychologists into diverse career pathways and settings. So the third layer is the professional organization section and the HPCSA, which is again quite contentious, but we're hoping we can make some changes here. So the first is mentoring and supervision, and all of these mentioned, Megan mentioned earlier that we are currently implementing in the SAACP division. So developing formal mentoring and supervision programs, and that's where the website may be quite helpful, linking up early career and more established counseling psychologists. And then also encouraging the HPCSA to acknowledge the provision of supervision as a CPD activity. So perhaps supervisors could claim back CPD points for offering supervision to recently qualified counseling psychologists. And I think this would be a great incentive. And then the online resources. So again, creating a centralized website, acknowledging unique counseling psychologist activities and accomplishments, published a list of mentors and recently graduated counseling psychologists. And this is an important one. We need to begin routinely publishing a list of counseling psychologists' workforce data. In other words, the employment trends. So I'm not sure how many practitioners are aware of this, but the HPCSA routinely, or each year with the registrations, have so much data at their disposal of who is registering, how old they are, where are they, what are they doing, etc., etc. But this data is not usually shared with practitioners themselves. And I think this is quite important and something that perhaps needs to change. And then having a centralized space where early career counseling psychologists can find information about how to register with the HPCSA, how to go about the BHF, where and what's the best option in terms of malpractice insurance, etc., etc. And then, as Megan mentioned, regularly populating the site with employment opportunities available to counseling psychologists, so that counseling psychologists have a place to go to see that there are opportunities out there which they can apply for that are outside of private practice. And then one other aspect is to encourage counseling psychologists, as Megan mentioned, to share short videos of themselves, showing what they do and where they are, to inspire early career counseling psychologists. Leadership in government, so it would be beneficial to dedicate at least one early career counseling psychologist on each decision-making committee. And then also to encourage reduced fees for early career psychologists, at least for the first 2 years. And I know the American Psychological Association, they offer this to their early career psychologists. In fact, they have a committee or a division just dedicated to early career psychologists, where they offer an early career psychologist boot camp each year. And this is often held at their conference. So we could, for example, hold it as an option at the SAACP conference, where early career psychologists can be trained on, for example, starting a private practice, starting to find work in alternative workforce settings, etc., etc. Right, and then this is the final slide, so we're nearly there. I hope everyone's still with me. And then this is the broadest level. So the workforce level, in terms of employment opportunities, we need to build an evidence base for the value and practice contributions of counseling psychologists in diverse settings. So it's one thing to say we need to advocate for counseling psychologists in public health settings, but it's another to prove or show evidence that we are valuable in those settings and how we can actually on the ground contribute and make a change and make difference. So what does that look like? We need to conduct routine workforce analyses, mentioned that. And it would also be quite helpful to design a system to track individuals from entry. So for example, at a master selection stage, right through on their entrance into the workforce and where they end up. So I remember when I was interviewing to be ultimately accepted into the master's program, I had asked the panel, where are your counseling psychologists, like where have they all ended up? And no one was really quite sure. So it would be wonderful to be able to track individuals, even maybe from an honours year, where in the pipeline are there bottlenecks, where are there high attrition rates, and how we can plug or bolster those gaps. And then it would be great if training programs could partner with prospective employers just to facilitate sort of that transition, for example, from intern counseling psychologists into the workforce, so that there is more of a link between being a training counseling psychologist and an independent one. And then policy and advocacy, of course, we need to continue to better publicize the profession and its role. We need to continue to lobby for the establishment of state-funded counseling psychologist posts. And we also need to try and set guidelines regarding excessive workloads and hours. I know many of you are part of the Facebook group, where often I've seen colleagues posting about how many hours or how many clients should we be seeing in a day. And these kind of things we don't know, so we should have a framework to work off. And then lastly, to encourage established counseling psychologists, those who've been in practice for many years, to reach out and foster those relationships with early career counseling psychologists, and to model a culture of self-care and work-life balance. So really to foster a culture of paying it forward. And before we end off, I'd just like to share this quote, and I feel quite strongly about it. I think this is key. But the profession is only as strong as the links in our professional chain, which can be solid and numerous. So remember to reach back in turn to welcome and support the next generation of counseling psychologists. So I'm going to leave you with that. Megan, I'll hand over to you.
Sure. What a powerful statement to end with. Thank you, Philippa. Just to reflect on some of the suggestions that you've put forward, what wonderful and innovative ideas. But we as a division cannot do this. We have to rely on the body of counseling psychologists in this country to join together and work towards this reality. And so I think the question then to the participants here is, how do we take this forward? What do we do? And maybe we can have some discussion now about, continuing to network and building this force together to change some of our experiences. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
We are getting lots of thank yous for this insightful presentation. Excellent start for the division. Well done. Exciting opportunities going forward. Thank you for the information. Wonderful work, Dr. Hain. Let's break down the barriers between different categories. Much appreciated. So, Philippa, you spoke about opening up the session. Was the idea to allow people? I don't know if people can unmute themselves. I think that they can just comment on the chat, if I'm understanding correctly. Maybe Shazia can just confirm that for us.
Sorry, Prof, I didn't catch that.
Can people actually unmute themselves and if they want to make comments, or must we just focus on the chat?
I can unmute them if they just raise their hand. Whoever has a comment, then I can unmute.
That would be great. Then maybe we could just enter into some discussion for the last sort of 25 minutes.
Sure.
Oh, and maybe Shazia, just to post the link for the evaluation form that needs to be completed for the HBCSA, for the CPD points.
Yeah, so I'm posting that now on the chat. Just a reminder to please complete this form to get your CPD points, and the link will only be available for 24 hours.
Just while we wait, I think, Philippa, your point around looking or exploring the option of CPD points for mentorship is such a good one. Yeah. And just to clarify, I've comments in the chat that the website for the division, the web page is up and running. As we go, we are doing updates. So I think you'll see that there's a call now around interest around mentorship, but we're just waiting for the Google form to be linked to the website, and then you'll see that you can note your details, your name, if you're interested there. Also, a number of people have shared work opportunities, so we'll see how we can go about creating a section on the web page to post those opportunities.
Hello, I'm not
So
sure
the
if you
Google
can hear
form
me.
should be up and running by tomorrow afternoon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Marita,
Yes,
you've got a comment?
I like the idea of the website with much information so that people can access it, but I want to challenge one of the statements that you've made, that the SAACP and the division cannot make advocacy for the position of counseling psychologist. I think it's important that you do, because we as individuals cannot do that. I cannot go to the Department of Health and say there is something wrong here. We also need some positions in the Department of Health. But as an elected, you can do that for the group as a whole. And I think that gives you a power that individuals do not have. And I want you to consider that.
Certainly. Megan?
No, you go ahead, Philippa.
I completely hear both sides, and I think certainly from our point, we can and we should be advocating for that, all of those aspects. I think, Megan, am I understanding you correctly, where we can't do it alone? We need everyone to be on board and kind of fighting this fight with us. Am I understanding?
Yeah, and I think also that as a division, maybe we can take it to SAACP higher up to advocate for us. And I think one of the points that was made was, how do we get counseling psychology into hospitals, into the government sector, and can SAACP advocate on our behalf? And we as a division can push that. But what I want to be wary of is that us 5 volunteers on this division, we cannot hold this by ourselves. So we create an unrealistic expectation. We really need the backing of our community.
So we will back you, surely.
Great. And I think that's where one of the recommendations I mentioned was to have an evidence base where we can show the benefit or the use of counseling psychologists in these settings. I think that going in with the data would be a powerful sort of tool on our side in that sense, in advocating.
Shazia, won't you just check the evaluation form? There seems to be a mistake on it. There's an incorrect name. Philippa's name's not on there. So some points here. I agree the professional societies and especially the university should take up the lead and address the problems with the profession on a government level. We should not need legal intervention. I just want to post, people are asking for the link to the website. So I'm just going to repost that for you. I would really encourage people, if you're interested in continuing this, taking this further, that you come and join one of the meet and greets. We're having one in Cape Town, in Joburg, in Port Elizabeth. If there's interest in other areas, let us know. It might not be possible for this year, but maybe for next year. So that becomes a space where we again come together and we try to build on some of the discussions that have happened tonight.
And Megan, I'm not sure if, I don't know if you'd like to speak about, I know that there's been the split off of counseling psychology in South Africa. This is separate from SAACP, the division of counseling psychology, where we're hoping to increase the collaboration there to bring counseling psychologists together, where there does seem to be quite a split. And a diminished interest in being involved in professional organizations, I think.
And maybe that also comes from a place of not feeling like these organizations are really advocating for us. Okay, we've noted the problem with the evaluation form. Thanks very much. I think Shazia will probably update it and then resend the link. The information about the meet and greet, you'll see that we'll circulate it closer to the time through the distribution list in SAACP and then on the division's webpage. So just keep a lookout there for information. And Nicholas asked if we could speak to the issue of the proposed generalist category. And I think that I'm not able to speak on that. I don't know, Philippa, if you want to talk a little bit about that, maybe there's somebody in the audience who knows, who wants to comment.
So I know Megan Charles, so for those who aren't aware, Charles Young has written a lot on counseling psychology in South Africa, and he subsequently immigrated to Australia, and he mentioned that in his research, having moved now, there's quite an issue with the generalist category where the division or the hierarchy just almost gets extended, and then new issues are created between those who have with the generalist category being an MA or master's level, and then being a specialization, a PhD or doctoral level, that creates its own issues and divisions.
But like someone was noting here, things are very unclear still at the moment, which is creating a lot of anxiety.
Yes.
Lynn, you've got your hand up. Lynn? Okay, otherwise, Marilyn, you've also got your hand up. Okay. I wonder whether this isn't maybe a good place for us to stop and ask you, Philippa, if you've got just maybe one or two last closing remarks that sit with you.
I think, well, just again, what an honor to be presenting this research tonight and relaying it. And I think, sure, there's much work to be done. There are opportunities, and I think there is space. And if we can stand together, a lot can be done.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've suddenly found how to unmute myself. I've been around for a very, very long time. So I started studying psychology probably in, it must have been 1973. That was before there were any issues with all these categories and all the rest of it. And at one stage in the early phases, psychopathology was divided into neurotics, believe it or not, and psychotics. So although psychologists were trained, that's clinical and counseling trained the same, in practice, the counseling psychologists were those to deal with the neurotics, sorry about that, and people who were dealing with their problems in the community, whereas the clinical psychs were supposed to be working in hospitals. And then everything kind of got blurred. And even although the training was pretty much the same, and the only difference was certain things with internships and stuff, then they came with this abhorrent scope of practice. And before that was promulgated, there was a lot of discussion and all kinds of things, and all sorts of proposals were put forward to the Health Professional Council, and they just ignored everything and did what they wanted. So I don't trust them. I think there's too much political interference, and it really needs a strong group of people to go up there and just say, we are the people working on the cold front. We need to represent ourselves, and we need to put down how our profession should be run, what we should do, etc., based on our training and our experience. That's my point. So yeah, we've got this thing with the intransigence of the people. There are politically appointed members of the Health Professional Council. We don't vote them in anymore. In the old days, we used to vote for our representatives. We don't do that anymore. So there we go, unfortunately. So I hope it changes in future. But I really think, particularly with the NHI and all the rest of it, and having so few posts for psychologists anyway in the national health system, the counseling psychologists are going to have an uphill battle.
Just on that point, Marilyn, I see that Ewald has posted that the HBCSA has regular engagements with professional organizations, but the division needs to highlight matters.
Sorry. Sorry, I just couldn't help, you know, no, I just can't help laughing. If you actually get any emails from them to say when they're going to sort of speak to the people working on the coalface, I would really like to get a copy of that, because they just don't communicate. I'm not sure about SAACP. I don't know how much information and how much collaboration there is with SAACP anymore, but yeah, it just seems to have gone downhill. Yeah, the one good thing that Zweli Nkize did when he came in to, you know, he was voted in as Minister of Health, was to do away with those scopes of practice. I don't know if anybody's aware of that. And to my knowledge, they were busy trying to put something together again. This is the Health Professional Council. Whether they've actually done something or not, I don't know. But I've actually got Government Gazette proof that Zweli Nkize signed a thing to say that he's scrapping that whole thing of scope of practice.
Thanks, Marilyn. I see that Ewald has just said he notes your comments, and he's now the counselling psychologist on the HBCSA professional board. So an option for us to do is to explore some of these recommendations that Philip has put forward tonight. Ask SAACP to petition on our behalf, some of the points that have been raised here, and see if we can get a conversation going. Okay, I think, Philippa, maybe let's finish up there, hey?
Sounds great, Megan. Thank you.
Just thank you once again for this incredible work and for your generosity in sharing it with us tonight. And thank you to everybody for your very active engagement. And let's hope that we can keep that up.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Megan.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.